Welcome to the Ultimate MetaSounds Reference Guide, Music. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the frequency to Midi, Midi to frequency, Midi note quantizer, and scale to note array nodes. Let's first look at the frequency to Midi and Midi to frequency nodes together. These are essentially just conversion nodes and do exactly as their name suggests. We have the ability to convert from a frequency float to a Midi float. Or in the opposite direction, we can convert either a Midi float or a Midi integer to a frequency float. Now for some of you, you may be thinking, Midi note values are whole numbers. Why would we need a Midi input or output that is a float value? And that is because while Midi notes on a keyboard or synthesizer are whole numbers, having this as a float will actually let us use microtones, which are values between standard notes. So for example, the default value of 60 is middle C. A Midi note value of 61 is then C#4. Having a float value allows us to input a value of 60.5 and we'll get a C note that is slightly sharper than middle C, but slightly flatter than C#. Now let's talk about our Midi note quantizer. I feel like this may need a bit of explanation because for those of you who work with Midi, you'll know the word quantize as meaning that it snaps the notes to a tempo grid for times when your playing might be slightly out of time. This node, however, will snap a Midi note to its nearest note value. As we mentioned with our previous float to float nodes, it is possible to get microtonal Midi values. But maybe that's not what you want. And if that's the case, then this node may be of some use to you. If your note in source contains decimal values, say something like 60.2, then this node will actually snap the note to a value of 60 to give us a perfect middle C. Think of it like auto-tune for your Midi. Now we do have a couple other inputs to help us control how our Midi note values are handled. The root note input allows us to define which note we are starting our scale on. For example, if we look at the C major scale, you'll see that C is in our first position, also known as our root. Now what if we wanted these notes, but we wanted our scale's root to be G? With this input, C equals 0, D equals 1, and so on. So with that in mind, we know that G equals 5. So we can drop a 5 here. Now what was once a C major scale has now been turned into a G mixolydian scale. Sort of. And by sort of, I mean we have to drop down to our third pin, which is our scale degrees. This is what defines which notes we wish to include in our scale. Because this is an array input, we can create an array of the notes that we want to include. But what happens if we aren't sure of what notes are included in the scale we want to use? That's where our final node for this video comes in, the scale to note array node. Here you'll find a drop-down list packed full of different scales. Now I'm not going to go through this drop-down and explain what all the different scales are because there's just too many of them. On this node, you'll also notice that we have a Boolean input for chord tones only. This will tell the node to pull a subset from the scale we've selected from our drop-down menu and only output values for chords. To see the full list of videos in this reference guide, click the link to the playlist in the description below.